She was forced to marry a man who could offer her nothing but his brokenness. But soon, she would discover that love can bloom even in the darkest corners of despair. The camera lingers on their faces, the tension palpable before fading to black. Nora had always been the picture of grace and beauty in her small village. She grew up with dreams of finding love that was passionate and free, something she had read about in books, seen in movies, and heard in the whispered secrets of her friends. She never imagined that her life would follow a different script, a script written by the harsh demands of her father's debts. Her father, once a successful farmer, had fallen into financial ruin. His mismanagement of the family's land and his inability to pay back loans had forced him into a desperate corner. With no other option, he made a deal with the wealthiest landowner in the region, Hugo, a man who had inherited his family's fortune and land. But there was a twist to this arrangement. Hugo wasn't the man he once was. Years of war and injury had left him crippled, his body twisted and scarred. He was a shell of the man he had been in his youth. Nora's father saw this as the only chance to secure the family's survival. Hugo's wealth would ease the burden of their debts, but for Nora it came at a great cost. She would marry a man who was nothing like the dream lover she had envisioned. Her heart sank as the day of the wedding approached, but the weight of her father's pleas crushed any resistance she might have had. On the day of the wedding, Hugo arrived in a carriage, his face partially hidden by the shadows. Nora's stomach twisted in knots as she glanced at the man she was about to marry. His eyes were tired, filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. She couldn't help but feel pity for him. But she would soon learn that pity, like love, can be a dangerous emotion, one that can shift and change in unexpected ways. The first night after the wedding felt like a dream Nora couldn't escape. It was a strange limbo, neither truly awake nor fully asleep. She found herself staring at the ceiling of the modest room she would now call her own, listening to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the man lying beside her. Hugo, her husband. The word tasted foreign in her mouth. The wedding had been simple, almost clinical. No warmth, no celebration, just a union of necessity. The moment the priest pronounced them man and wife, Nora had felt a wave of resignation wash over her. She was no longer a daughter of the house, but the wife of a cripple, a man who couldn't give her the life she had dreamed of, a man who could barely move without pain. Nora shifted uncomfortably in bed, her thoughts racing. She had tried to keep her face neutral throughout the evening, but deep down she was terrified. Was this truly her life now? Forced to live with a man who was so broken in body and spirit? She had been raised to honor her commitments, and this was one she could never break. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of injustice, the bitterness that had begun to settle deep within her. The morning after the wedding was no easier. The sun barely pierced through the thick curtains of their bedroom, and the air was heavy with the dampness of the rain that had fallen through the night. Hugo had already risen, his movements slow and deliberate. Nora had heard him earlier, trying to dress himself in the corner of the room. She was still lying in bed, trying to gather the courage to face him. She could hear him struggle as he pulled his jacket on, the sound of fabric rustling against the weight of his limbs. When he finally turned to face her, he was fully dressed, his eyes hidden behind a layer of melancholy. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage to his body. The leg that had once carried him with pride was now bound by crutches, his back slightly hunched from years of unhealed wounds. His face, too, was marked by years of suffering, a man who had given up everything to war, only to return broken. Nora sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders as though to shield herself from the vulnerability of the situation. Hugo smiled faintly at her, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had always been a quiet man, but today there was an air of exhaustion around him, a heaviness that made the room feel smaller. "I hope you slept well," Hugo said, his voice gravely as if he hadn't spoken in days. Nora forced a smile, even though it felt unnatural. "I did, thank you. Are you all right?" He nodded, but there was a sadness that lingered in his eyes. "I've had better mornings," he admitted softly, setting his crutches aside. He sat at the edge of the bed, wincing as he adjusted his position, Nora wanted to say something comforting, but the words stuck in her throat. What was there to say? She had spent years dreaming of a life of adventure, freedom, and love, but now those dreams had crumbled, replaced by an uncertain reality. How could she comfort him when she didn't even know how to comfort herself? Later that morning, Hugo suggested they take a walk in the garden. The weather had cleared, and despite the heaviness of the situation, there was a sense of calm in the air. It was a simple request, but Nora could sense there was more to it. He had been quiet all morning, his body moving as if it were a part of his struggle to hold himself together. "Would you like to walk with me?" he asked again, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. It was strange, but Nora felt a spark of something she hadn't expected: curiosity. Despite the fact that Hugo had been forced upon her, there was a part of her that couldn't help but wonder who he truly was. There had to be more to him than the broken man sitting in front of her. Perhaps, hidden beneath the surface, there was something worth discovering. She nodded reluctantly. "All right." They stepped out into the garden, and the cool morning air greeted them. The garden was filled with vibrant flowers, their colors dampened slightly by the rain, but still alive with beauty. Hugo's movements were slow, but he led the way, navigating the path with surprising ease for someone who appeared so frail. As they walked, Nora couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed from the night before. There was no longer a cold distance between them. There was tension, yes, but also something else, a quiet understanding, as if they both knew that their futures were now intertwined in ways neither of them could have anticipated. "So," Hugo began, breaking the silence, "how did you feel last night?" Nora was taken aback. She had assumed that Hugo would be too caught up in his own feelings to ask her about hers, but his question was sincere. He seemed almost vulnerable. Nora hesitated. She didn't know how to explain it. "I didn't expect things to be like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Hugo nodded as though he had expected her to say this. "I understand. I know what I am to you, and I know you didn't choose this. But I need you to know one thing. I'm not asking for your pity. I don't want it. I want to find a way for us to make this work. To find a way to make our lives something meaningful, even if it's not what either of us imagined." Nora was silent for a long moment, processing his words. She had expected bitterness, anger, maybe even resentment from him, but instead there was an openness that caught her off guard. It was as if Hugo was not only accepting his circumstances, but also inviting her into his world, into the messiness of it all. "I don't know if I can do that," she finally said. "I don't know if I can ever feel what you want me to feel." Hugo smiled faintly. "You don't have to, Nora. Not yet. But I promise you, over time, you'll see there's more to me than just the man you married out of obligation." As they continued walking through the garden, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. She didn't know if it was hope or just the lingering remnants of pity, but she couldn't ignore the growing curiosity inside her. She wanted to know more about this man, this crippled soul who had somehow sparked something in her that she hadn't expected. Later that evening, as Nora sat alone in the drawing room, she couldn't stop thinking about Hugo's words. There was a story there, one she had yet to uncover. A story of hardship, perhaps, but also of survival. She could see it in his eyes, the depth of it. But Hugo had been closed off from the world for so long that she doubted she would ever be able to reach him. Just as she was about to retire to bed, Hugo entered the room. This time he was carrying a worn-out book in his hands. It looked old, the leather cover cracked with age. "I thought you might like this," Hugo said, handing her the book. "It's a collection of poems. They were my mother's." Nora looked at the book with curiosity. She didn't expect to find anything of real interest in it, but something about the gesture felt significant. She opened the first page and began to read. As she read, she was drawn into the words, into the emotions that they invoked. For the first time since meeting Hugo, she felt a connection, an understanding of who he had once been, who he was now, and perhaps who he could become. But the mystery deepened. Why had Hugo chosen this moment to share his mother's poems with her? What was it about this book that had made him reach out to her? She couldn't quite place it, but she knew that this gesture was the beginning of something important, and she was just starting to understand the layers of Hugo's story that had been buried under years of silence. As Nora closed the book and looked up at Hugo, she could see the quiet desperation in his eyes. He was offering her more than just a book. He was offering her a glimpse into his soul. And for the first time, Nora wondered if perhaps there was something more to this marriage than she had first believed. The real mystery had just begun. The days that followed the wedding began to blur together in a haze of routine and strained politeness. Nora's life with Hugo, though quiet and filled with small gestures of kindness, felt anything but natural. The initial tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall between them that neither had the courage to break down. Hugo continued to be a quiet presence in their home, his movements slow and deliberate as if each task required more energy than he could give. His reliance on crutches had made him almost dependent on others for basic tasks, and yet there was a stubborn pride in him, an unwillingness to ask for help, that created a constant tension. Despite his obvious physical limitations, Hugo maintained a sense of dignity that both intrigued and frustrated Nora. She wasn't sure if she was meant to pity him or admire him. She tried her best to be a dutiful wife, keeping the house clean and making meals, but the emptiness in her chest only seemed to grow the longer she stayed in the marriage. There was no romance, no spark between them, just silence. Silent dinners, silent evenings, silent walks in the garden. Even the way Hugo looked at her was filled with a type of quiet resignation. He never asked her about her past, never asked her about her hopes or dreams. Instead, he would sit by the fire, reading the same worn-out book of poetry, as if he too were locked in a quiet prison of his own. The conflict between them was not overt. It wasn't the kind of battle where words were exchanged in anger. Instead, it was a quiet war. Nora's resentment simmered just beneath the surface, while Hugo seemed to bear his scars in silence, both physical and emotional. Yet, despite the tension, there was a kind of pull between them, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could ignore. It was a dangerous game of emotions they played every day, one that neither of them was willing to confront head-on. Nora's curiosity about Hugo grew, despite herself. She found herself wondering about the man he had once been. Who was the man before the war, before the crippling injury? She couldn't imagine him as anything other than the broken man sitting in front of her, but there had to be more. Hugo had moments when his old self seemed to shine through, a flicker of humor, a glimpse of the confidence he once had, a memory of something that had been lost in time. But these moments were rare, fleeting. One evening, after dinner, Nora found herself staring out the window at the horizon, her mind wandering. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the land, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own dissatisfaction. She had married Hugo out of necessity, out of a sense of duty to her family, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself. She had once been a dreamer, a woman with aspirations beyond the confines of this small town. Now she was trapped in a house with a man she barely knew, a man who was more of a stranger to her than she cared to admit. "Are you all right?" Hugo's voice broke through her thoughts. He was standing behind her, his crutches propped up against the doorframe. His face was unreadable, but there was a quiet concern in his eyes. Nora turned, startled. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, trying to hide the frustration in her voice. Hugo seemed to study her for a moment before he spoke again. "You don't have to pretend with me, Nora. I know I'm not the man you expected to marry." The honesty in his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't realized how much she had been pretending. She hadn't realized that deep down she had hoped for something more, something that would make her feel alive again. But there was nothing between them, nothing but this awkward, strained silence. "Maybe I'm just tired," she said softly. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect you to be like this." Hugo nodded, his face darkening with something akin to shame. "I didn't expect any of it either, but it's the hand we've been dealt, Nora. We can't change it now." Nora felt a rush of anger swell up inside her. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Her father's debts had forced her into this marriage, and now she was stuck in a life that wasn't hers to live. She had always dreamed of something different, something more exciting, more vibrant. Instead, she was stuck in a home filled with silence, bound by an unspoken contract she had never signed willingly. But as she stood there looking at Hugo, something unexpected happened. Her anger shifted, just for a moment, into something else. Pity. She didn't want to pity him, but she couldn't help it. He was just as much a prisoner of circumstances as she was. His injuries, his silence, his inability to escape his past, it all weighed on him in ways that Nora couldn't fully understand. Maybe we don't have to change everything, she said slowly, as though the idea was forming in her mind in real time. Maybe we just have to find a way to live with what we have. Hugo's eyes softened. He nodded, but his expression was still distant. It's not easy, Nora. Life never is. And so they continued on in their quiet, shared existence. The days stretched out before them, each one blending into the next. Yet there was a growing tension beneath the surface, something that neither of them could ignore. Nora had begun to feel a stirring deep inside her, something that whispered of possibilities beyond the boundaries of this small home, this small life. It was during one of their evening walks in the garden that the first cracks began to appear in the facade they had both carefully constructed. Nora had grown used to the silence, used to the way Hugo kept his distance from her, both physically and emotionally. But tonight, something was different. As they walked together, the soft murmur of the evening breeze was the only sound between them. "Do you ever miss it?" Nora asked, her voice low. "Miss what?" Hugo asked, glancing over at her. "Life, before all this, before the injury, before the marriage." Hugo stopped walking, his crutches digging into the ground as he turned to face her. "You mean, do I miss being whole? Do I miss the man I was before the war?" He sighed, his face darkening. "Yes, Nora, I miss him every single day." Nora's heart clenched at the rawness of his words. She had never thought to ask him about his past. She had always been so focused on her own feelings of entrapment that she had forgotten that Hugo, too, had been trapped in his own way. "I'm sorry," she said, feeling the weight of his pain in her chest. Hugo gave a small, bitter laugh. "There's nothing to apologize for. You're just as much a prisoner here as I am." The words hung between them, and for the first time Nora saw the man behind the mask. He wasn't just the broken husband she had been forced to marry. He was a man who had lost everything. The life he once knew, the person he had been, and now even the woman he had married. They were both prisoners of circumstance, caught in a life neither had chosen. And yet there was a flicker of something else in Hugo's eyes, a flicker of hope, however faint. Perhaps they both had a chance to break free, to find something within themselves that neither had expected. But that would take more than just time. It would take effort, understanding, and the willingness to face the deep, painful truths they had both been avoiding. As they continued their walk, Nora realized that despite everything, she had begun to see Hugo differently. He wasn't just the crippled man she had been forced to marry. He was a man with a story that was still unfolding, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to rewrite it together. The rain had been falling steadily for days now, transforming the garden into a quiet, reflective haven. It wasn't just the weather that seemed to hold the town in suspense, though. Something was changing between Nora and Hugo. It wasn't the kind of change that could be easily noticed, not in the way they looked at each other or the way they spoke. But something in the air between them felt different, as though they were both holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment of reckoning. That moment arrived one crisp afternoon when Hugo, unusually quiet, insisted they take a walk in the garden, just as they had done on the days before. But this time it was different. There was an unspoken urgency in his voice, a tension that Nora could feel even before he spoke. "We need to talk," he said, stopping at the entrance to the garden, his crutches digging into the damp earth as he steadied himself. His voice trembled slightly, though he did his best to mask it. "I need to tell you something." Nora stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard that tone in his voice before, when the air was thick with emotion, when words became more than just words. She felt the familiar wave of nervousness hit her, the uncertainty creeping back into her thoughts. Was this it? Was this the moment when everything would finally unravel? She looked at him, but his face was guarded. There was nothing to prepare her for what was coming. "What's wrong, Hugo?" she asked softly, her words hesitant. Her fingers fidgeted nervously with the hem of her sleeve. The anticipation in the air felt thick, oppressive. Hugo shifted slightly on his crutches before speaking. "I've been holding on to something for a long time, something you need to know, something that you deserve to know." He paused, his gaze drifting to the garden before returning to her. "Before I was injured, I wasn't just the man you see now. I was someone different. I had a life, I had dreams, and I had a future that was stolen from me." Nora's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a step forward, her heart pounding harder now. She had heard hints of Hugo's past, but never like this. Never with such intensity. She had always wondered about the man he had been before, the man whose dreams had been shattered in the blink of an eye, but she had never asked. And now it seemed like he was about to reveal the most painful part of his story. "I don't want your pity, Nora," Hugo continued, his voice growing quieter, more vulnerable. "I never wanted it, not from you or anyone. But I know you've seen me differently. I know you've seen me as the man who's broken. And you're right, I am broken, but not in the way you think." Nora's mind raced as she listened, each word he spoke sinking deeper into her heart. She had always viewed Hugo as someone she had been forced to marry, but now she was beginning to see him not as a cripple, but as a man who had suffered. The weight of his past, of the life he had lost, began to settle over her like a heavy cloak. It was a painful realization, one that both terrified and fascinated her. She had spent so long viewing him through the lens of her own anger and resentment that she had never thought about the pain he had endured. She reached out, a reflex of empathy, her hand touching his arm lightly. "What happened to you, Hugo?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with the emotion she could no longer contain. Hugo took a deep breath, his eyes clouding with emotion. "I was a soldier," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fought in a war, one I thought I was fighting for the right reasons. I wanted to protect the people I loved, to defend my country. But I was wrong. I was a fool. I thought I could be a hero, but the war didn't make me a hero. It made me a monster." Nora's heart sank as she listened, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. She had known Hugo's injury was related to the war, but she hadn't realized the depth of the psychological scars he carried. The idea of war, of soldiers fighting for something they believed in, had always been distant to her. But hearing Hugo's voice tremble with the rawness of his pain, she understood, for the first time, the human cost of it all. "I was involved in something I wish I could forget," Hugo continued, his gaze distant. "I was part of a unit that was sent to clear a village. There was no need for it. We were told that it was for our protection, but we were given orders to wipe out the enemy, to leave no one standing." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the memory. "I still hear their screams at night, the screams of the innocent. I didn't kill them, but I was part of the massacre. I stood by and did nothing, and for that I will never forgive myself." Nora's breath caught in her throat, and her hands trembled as she reached for him. She had heard stories of war, of the horrors soldiers faced, but it had always been something distant, something abstract. Now it was real. The man standing before her, the man she had married out of duty, was not just the crippled husband she had resented. He was a man who had been torn apart by the choices he had made. How could you live with that?" Nora asked, her voice barely audible, her heart aching for him. Hugo's eyes flickered with pain. "I didn't, Nora. I didn't live, not really. When I came back from the war, I couldn't face what I had done. So I buried myself in alcohol, in isolation. I thought I could drown out the memories, but they never went away. The scars weren't just on my body, they were inside me, too." Nora felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, but no words seemed adequate. How could she tell him she understood? How could she tell him that despite everything, she could see the man behind the pain? The man who had been broken but still fought to keep his dignity intact. She swallowed hard, trying to hold back tears. "But you're still here. You're still alive, and you didn't give up." Hugo looked at her, his gaze softening. "I'm still here because I had no other choice, Nora. But that doesn't mean I'm not a prisoner of my own guilt. Every day I wake up, I feel the weight of what I did, of what I couldn't stop, but I still have to live with it somehow." The words hung in the air between them, thick with emotion. For the first time, Nora felt like she was truly seeing Hugo, the man who had been so quiet, so distant, so unknowable. He wasn't just the man who had been forced into this marriage by circumstance. He was a man who had suffered, who had paid the price for choices he could never undo. And in that moment, Nora felt something inside her shift. The anger, the resentment, the frustration, everything that had kept her from seeing him as a person, as someone worthy of her understanding, began to fade away. She realized that, just like her, Hugo was struggling to find his way. He wasn't just a victim of his circumstances. He was a man who had been scarred by a past he couldn't change, but who still held on to the hope that somehow, someday, he could find redemption. Tears welled up in Nora's eyes as she reached out to touch his arm. "Hugo, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." He didn't say anything in response. Instead, he simply nodded, the weight of their shared silence speaking volumes. For the first time in their marriage, the invisible wall that had separated them began to crack. Nora took a deep breath, the words she had been too afraid to say finally coming to the surface. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see you, not as my obligation, not as the man I was forced to marry, but as someone who deserves a chance for both of us to start over." Hugo's eyes softened, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of hope in them. It was small, but it was there. The emotional climax had arrived, the moment when the weight of their respective pasts collided and created a new understanding between them. And from that moment forward, everything had changed. The days after the emotional revelation were strange, filled with a quiet sense of relief, but also an undercurrent of unease. Nora found herself looking at Hugo differently, seeing him not just as a man bound to a crumbling body, but as someone who had endured unimaginable suffering. Yet, despite the connection that had begun to form between them, there was still a lingering distance, a shadow that neither of them knew how to chase away. In the weeks that followed, Nora found herself drawn into the unspoken tension that existed between them. Their days were spent in a strange rhythm. There was no grand romance, no fireworks. Instead, there were small moments that sometimes felt real, but often felt like they were only a pale imitation of something she had longed for. Hugo, for his part, seemed to retreat further into himself. He would spend long hours in the garden or in his study, reading old books of poetry and writing in journals that Nora had never seen. Occasionally, he would try to engage with her, asking how her day had gone, but it was always distant. There was no passion in his voice, no urgency in his eyes. Nora had expected his wounds to heal, at least to some extent, but they remained. The physical ones were easier to ignore. The emotional ones, they remained raw, unhealed. One morning, as she was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Nora felt the first shift in their relationship. It wasn't a small change either. It was a sharp, violent shift, a crack that threatened to undo everything. It was the sound of shouting that drew her from the warmth of the kitchen. The shrillness of it made her heart skip a beat, and before she knew it, she was standing at the threshold of the living room, her hand frozen on the doorframe. Hugo was standing by the window, his face flushed with anger, his crutches abandoned on the floor beside him. His arms were raised in frustration, his voice shaking with emotion. Nora couldn't make out the words at first, but she didn't need to. She could feel the intensity of the moment, the growing storm that was now flooding their home. "I'm sick of this, Nora." Hugo's voice broke through the silence like a thunderclap. "I'm sick of pretending. I'm sick of being the man you feel sorry for. I'm sick of being stuck in this marriage that neither of us wanted." Nora's heart raced, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had never seen him like this, never witnessed the full fury of his anger. It was as if everything they had talked about, everything they had shared, had been swept away in an instant. The calm, patient man she had known had exploded, and she had no idea how to respond. "Hugo, please," Nora started, her voice shaking. "No." Hugo's voice was louder now, his crutches clattering against the floor as he took a step toward her. "I've had enough, Nora. I can't keep living this lie. I can't keep pretending that we're happy, that everything is fine. I can't keep living in a house where everything is about duty and nothing about love." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment Nora felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. This wasn't just about the anger she had seen in him before. This was something darker, something more desperate. He wasn't just angry at her, he was angry at the entire situation, the life he had been forced to accept. And Nora, in turn, felt a deep frustration rise within her. It wasn't just his anger that was consuming him, it was her anger, too. She was angry at him for not understanding her pain, for not seeing that she, too, was trapped in a life that was not of her choosing. "I didn't ask for this either," Nora shouted back, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't ask to be in this marriage. I didn't ask to marry a man who could barely stand on his own, who couldn't even look at me without seeing the person he hated." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time since their wedding, Nora saw the full force of Hugo's pain. He staggered back as if her words had struck him physically, his face turning pale. "I never hated you, Nora," he whispered, his voice low, almost inaudible. "I never hated you. But I hated what I had become. I hated the man I was after the war, and I hated that I had to drag you into this life, into this prison with me." Nora stood frozen, her breath coming in short bursts. She had never seen Hugo like this, had never imagined that beneath the anger, beneath the layers of guilt and shame, there was a man who was desperately trying to hold on to his humanity. "But this isn't living, Hugo," she said softly, her voice shaking. "This isn't a life. You're not living, and I'm not living. I'm stuck in a marriage where there's no affection, no connection, and I don't know what to do anymore." Hugo's expression faltered, and for a brief moment he seemed to collapse in on himself. His shoulders slumped, and his crutches fell to the floor with a dull thud. He sank to the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered again, his voice raw with emotion. Nora stepped forward, her chest tight with the weight of his words. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. It was as if the very walls they had built to protect themselves from each other had now become prisons, trapping them both in their own personal hell. "I know," she whispered. "I know you didn't, but I didn't either." In the weeks that followed that moment of confrontation, the tension between them reached a breaking point. The storm they had been holding inside had finally torn through the fragile facade they had built. The anger, the frustration, the isolation, they were all laid bare, exposed for both of them to see. Hugo withdrew even further. He began spending even more time alone, retreating into his study or the garden, where he would sit in silence for hours. Nora tried to approach him, to offer comfort, but every attempt felt futile. It was as if he had closed off completely, unwilling or unable to confront the deep, searing emotions that now simmered beneath the surface. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake, if they had both made a mistake in trying to build a life together when neither of them was truly free. But it wasn't just Hugo's silence that hurt her, it was her own. She had become someone she barely recognized. The woman who had once been full of dreams and aspirations now found herself suffocating in a life she had never wanted. She missed her old self, the girl who had been full of hope, who had believed in love. Now, she didn't know who she was anymore. One night, after another long day of silence, Nora sat by the window, staring out into the darkened garden. She hadn't seen Hugo for hours, and the house felt colder than it ever had. She had no idea what to do anymore, no idea how to fix what had broken between them. But then the door creaked open, and Hugo entered the room. His face was tired, but his eyes were different. There was something raw and vulnerable in them, something she had never seen before. "I can't keep doing this," Hugo said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I need you to understand, Nora, that this wasn't what I wanted for either of us, but it's the only life I have left, and I don't want to drag you down with me anymore." Nora's heart ached as she listened to him. It wasn't what she wanted either. It wasn't what either of them wanted. But somewhere deep inside she knew that they couldn't keep going like this. There had to be something else, something they hadn't yet discovered. They couldn't keep living in the shadows of their pasts, unable to move forward. "I don't want to drag you down either," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her own confession. "But I don't know how to move forward, Hugo. I don't know how to fix this." Hugo looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe we don't have to fix it. Maybe we just need to stop pretending that we have to be something we're not. Maybe we need to find a way to live with the mess, to find something in it that's real." In the hours that followed, Nora and Hugo both began to realize that their marriage, as it had been, could not survive. The weight of their pasts, of their pain, their guilt, their unspoken desires, had left scars too deep to ignore. But there was something in Hugo's words, something in the way he finally reached out to her with honesty, that sparked a glimmer of hope. They couldn't erase the past. They couldn't undo the years of silence and resentment. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a new way forward, one where neither of them had to be trapped in their own suffering. This was the turning point, the moment when they both realized that the only way to move forward was together. But it would take time, patience, and an understanding of who they were beyond the roles they had been forced to play. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, they both felt a spark of possibility. The air in the room was thick with the unspoken. The tension that had been building between Nora and Hugo for months had finally come to a head. It wasn't just the arguments, the silences, or the resentment that had festered in their relationship. It was the realization that they had both been living in a state of emotional paralysis. Neither one knew how to move forward, how to break the chains of their pasts and their mistakes, and somehow build a life together. But now, in this moment, it was clear something had to give. Nora sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands resting on her lap, her heart hammering in her chest. Hugo stood at the window, looking out into the darkened garden, his figure silhouetted against the dim light coming through the glass. The distance between them, both emotional and physical, felt insurmountable. But it was also palpable, something that neither of them could ignore anymore. "What do we do now, Hugo?" Nora's voice was a whisper, her words heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between them. She couldn't meet his gaze, couldn't bear the idea of seeing his pain reflected back at her. Yet she knew this moment would determine everything, the future of their relationship, their lives, and their happiness. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. "I don't know," Hugo answered softly, his voice almost hollow, "but I do know one thing. We can't keep going like this. We can't keep living in this endless cycle of guilt, resentment, and silence. It's killing us, Nora. It's killing me." Nora swallowed hard. The words were sharp, painful, but true. She had been numb for so long, unable to process the emotional wreckage that surrounded her. She had told herself for months that she could live this way, that she could endure the cold, silent spaces between them, that somehow she could accept the life she had been thrust into. But now, in the face of the truth, she knew that she couldn't. She had to make a decision. She had to take control of her life again. She stood up, her legs shaky, but her resolve beginning to solidify. "I've been thinking, Hugo. We've both been thinking too much about what we've lost, what's been taken from us. But maybe, just maybe, we're missing something. We're too focused on what we don't have, on what's broken. We're not looking at what's still here, what could be." Hugo turned to look at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. He hadn't expected her to say that. He hadn't expected her to be the one to make the first move, to speak up. But there was a rawness to her words, an urgency that was undeniable. "What are you saying, Nora?" Hugo's voice was hesitant, as though he was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that things could change. "Are you saying we can fix this, after everything we've been through?" "No, I'm not saying we can fix everything," Nora replied, her voice steady now. "But I am saying that we don't have to keep living in this cycle. We don't have to stay trapped in the past. We can't change the things that happen to us, but we can choose how we move forward from here. Together." Hugo stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His crutches lay forgotten on the floor beside him, as if they too had become symbols of his dependency, of everything that had kept him shackled to a life he didn't choose. "I don't know how to move forward," Hugo admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to stop being the man I was before the war, before everything that happened." Nora stepped forward, closing the space between them. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his arm. The contact was tentative, but it was enough. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of something that wasn't bitterness or resentment. It was a faint glimmer of connection. "You don't have to be that man, Hugo," she said softly. "You don't have to carry that burden anymore. We both have scars, but that doesn't mean we can't find something real between us, something that matters." Hugo's eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show her the extent of his vulnerability. He had always prided himself on his strength, even if it was now a shadow of what it once had been. But he couldn't deny it anymore. Nora was right. They both needed to let go. Let go of the past, let go of the guilt, let go of the anger. And for the first time, Hugo realized that he was no longer just a man broken by the war. He was a man who still had the capacity to rebuild, to heal, to love. But he needed Nora by his side. He couldn't do it alone. He took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he could muster. He reached out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "Nora, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I'll ever be the man you deserve, but I'm willing to try. For you. For us." The words were a beginning that neither of them had dared to speak before. Nora looked into his eyes and saw something there that hadn't been present before. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from vulnerability, from opening yourself up to someone, even when the future feels uncertain. The moment stretched out as if the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. It was terrifying, exhilarating, everything and nothing all at once. The world around them seemed to fade away as they stood there, standing together in a silence that was no longer filled with regret. It was filled with possibility. And then Hugo did something unexpected. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as he kissed her forehead, his touch gentle but firm, as though he was grounding them both in this moment. Nora closed her eyes, leaning into his embrace. For the first time in a long while, she felt something that was real. It wasn't love yet, at least not in the way she had always imagined it. But it was something else, a recognition that they were both broken in their own ways, and yet, together, they could find a path forward. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," Hugo whispered, his lips brushing against her hair, "but we can find them, together." Nora nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew this. They had taken the first step toward healing. They had chosen each other, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to build something real. Something imperfect, yes, but something that could be enough. "I'm scared, Hugo," Nora admitted, her voice quiet, "but I'm ready to try." "Me too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "We'll take it one day at a time, together." For the first time since their marriage had begun, Nora felt the weight of her decision lift. She had made a choice, not to fix everything, but to move forward. And Hugo, though scarred and still carrying the weight of his past, had chosen to walk beside her. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. The days that followed their confrontation were quiet, yet charged with a new energy. The air in the house felt different, lighter, less burdened by the weight of unspoken words. Hugo and Nora began to rebuild, not from the ground up, but from the pieces that had always been there, buried beneath their resentment, their pain, and their fears. They spent their days together, slowly rediscovering each other, not as strangers or as two people forced into a marriage by circumstance, but as individuals who were learning to see one another for the first time. They had no illusions that everything would be perfect. There were moments of silence, of discomfort, but they were no longer afraid of those moments. They had learned that silence didn't have to be filled with regret. It could simply be a space for reflection, for healing. Nora found herself talking more openly, sharing her thoughts and dreams, even the fears she had kept hidden for so long. Hugo, too, began to open up about his past, not in painful bursts, but in quiet, measured conversations. He told her stories of the man he had once been before the war, and though those stories were filled with loss, they were also filled with strength, the strength of a man who had endured unimaginable hardship and still found the courage to move forward. In the evenings, they would walk together in the garden, just as they had so many times before. But now those walks felt different. They were no longer just passing time. They were moments of connection, of shared understanding. The tension between them had softened, replaced by a fragile but undeniable bond. One evening, as they stood side by side watching the sun dip below the horizon, Hugo turned to Nora with a small but genuine smile. "We don't have all the answers yet," he said softly, his voice steady, "but we're figuring it out, together." Nora smiled back, her heart full. "We're not perfect, but we're enough. We always have been." And in that moment, Nora understood something she had never truly grasped before. The love she had once thought impossible wasn't some grand, sweeping thing. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was the quiet understanding between two people who had seen the darkest parts of each other and had chosen to stay. It was imperfect, but it was real. As the sun set behind them, they stood together, not as two broken people, but as two souls who had found a way to heal, side by side, moving forward with no promises, only the commitment to face whatever came next, together.